I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernica, and I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
Welcome to our second ever 2019 Bear That Fruit episode of the Magnificast. That's right, it's 2019, and it's up to you to bear all that good Christian fruit, those big, delicious, juicy apples of the Spirit. So in this episode, we got a lot of cool stuff coming. We're going to talk about parties and Jodi Dean and why people don't like them and maybe why they should join them. Well, like communist parties, not the other ones, because those ones are boring. Before we get there, we have a few housekeeping items that we need to get on. The first and most important housekeeping item is Amaria Shea. If you like our cool intro music, you might like this new EP from Amaria. It's called My Mother's House EP. You can find it on Bandcamp at amariashay.bandcamp.com. And it's neat, and you can buy it for $5, but you can also just listen to it, but you should definitely buy it. So, I don't know. I'm always surprised whenever I listen to an episode of the Magnificast because the intro music is so cool. So I'm a real big fan of Amaria, and I'm very excited that she has released an EP. So check it out.
Yeah, it's super good. I listened to it and can say it's good.
It's got that Dean seal of approval. 5
out of 5 review.
29 Dean approval. Speaking out of 5 out of 5 reviews, we haven't done this in a while, but we're gonna go ahead and do it because we finally have a new one. We're gonna read our iTunes reviews. Back in October, we got a 3 out of 5 stars, and since then we have been in an iTunes review drought. But we got a new one.
Just those 3 stars, they really dissuaded everyone.
That's right. It set a very negative tone for the review environment. But back on December 11th, we got a new one. I haven't been checking them because of all the negativity. But we have a new one, and I'm going to read it. So the title of this review is called Loosing Chains, and chains is spelled with a Z, so you know it's good.
Oh, nice.
5 out of 5 stars.
I love that album.
Yeah, Loosing Chains, that's right. Man, if that is not a contemporary Christian album, I do not know what is.
Toby Mac's Lost EP.
That's right. Okay, well, this user writes, been listening since day one, which is quite the achievement. I don't want to make any jokes about that because it's too real. These dudes bring on the best guests, recommend the best books, and inspire action. When I jumped in, I thought it'd be fun to have a homegrown show that kind of spoke to my religious and political ideas, but I've been pleasantly surprised at how they've grown into a legitimate voice of the Christian left TM and challenged both my religion and politics, and this is all while keeping it breezy. The Beavis and Butthead in between Marxist and scripture readings really work for me. That's cool. That is definitely our aesthetic, is sort of a very smart Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah, produced by Mike Judge.
Well, that was a kind thing for someone to have written. I can't even imagine listening to this podcast since the first episode.
I don't think that I have, actually.
Yeah, I probably missed a few episodes here and there. Like, editing a podcast episode is definitely different than listening to it as well, so
yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, way different. Yeah. I don't know which one of us is Beavis and which one is Butthead, but
We're both
wasn't allowed to watch
simultaneously.
that show, so yeah, I guess so. That's right. They do come as a unit, package deal.
Becoming Beavis and Butthead.
That's what someone needs to make. Mike Judge needs to make a Marx and Engels, like young Marx, fictional biopic, but it's just Beavis and Butthead talking about capital.
The Young Marx movie is actually not super different than that. It's also come to our attention on Twitter this week that we've ruffled some feathers by being a very pro-cussing sort of brand, a pro-cussing internet brand, and I want Dean to kind of explain our... sorry, hang on, let me back this up. I want the VP of cussing, Dean Deloff, to come and talk about our new stance on cussing on the Magnificast.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you for coming to this press conference. I'll be brief. I'll keep things brief. I know that people have other engagements. The Magnificast is pro cussing. That's not to say that we are regular cussers. Only that we are pro cussers. If you're a cusser, if you like a couple of cusses now and then, you're more than welcome on this podcast. You're more than welcome on our Twitter feed. Apologies to all of our moms, but no apologies to the trads.
So, in case you are very confused by this new aggressively pro-cussing stance that we're taking, some people on Twitter got very mad at Ben Wildflower for having a swear next to the picture of the Virgin Mary on the Magnificast t-shirt. And he's handling it really well, but the trads are so mad about it. Very upset. But anyways... on the Magnificast, we're listed as clean lyrics, but you're, likely to hear a piss every now and again.
Yeah, every now and then also again, you'll hear a piss.
That's true. I think I've actually only sworn on the podcast maybe once, but other people do.
Yeah,
it's fine with me.
I'm not a cusser by nature, but I appreciate a good cuss.
I like cussing behind closed doors, not publicly.
Yeah, no, I feel that way too. When you're in a safe environment to cuss, and you can just kind of really, really take your cussing socks off and just let it all hang out,
Mm-hmm. Let all the cusses out.
Cool. That's all the housekeeping notes. The house is now kept in order. Finally cleaned it up. It's been a while. It's looking a little dirty around here. Let's dive into it. This week, we're going to talk about communist parties. We've kind of softly gotten into this a little bit in the past. A while ago even in the beginning, we had some episodes with Derek Ford, a Marxist-Leninist who's a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and he talked about it a little bit. And we also had Jodi Dean on the show, and she talked about it a little bit, and we're going to talk about a couple of books that she wrote, or at least some points that she makes in them. But we've never really sat down and made we've never made it a thing to think about why someone would want to join a communist party, why someone wouldn't, and, maybe a little bit more about how Christians have tried to negotiate that relationship. So that's kind of like the little roadmap for the episode. We're going to first talk a little bit about why people aren't into parties, following Jodi Dean a little bit, and then switch to why people should like parties, and talk a little bit about what they are and what they do. And we're going to then move into how some Christians have negotiated that relationship, and that might give us some ways to talk about or think about why Christians should join communist parties today, or at least what that would mean, and maybe even what it would not mean. So we'll kind of see what happens. We've got a loose set of notes here that we're going to riff off of, but let's dive into it. Matt, why don't people like communist parties?
That's a really great question. It does seem like people don't like parties, and exactly the reason why is one that we'd probably have to parse out. Jodi Dean has a little bit of an illuminating bit of insight in her book, Crowd and Parties. I think we can kind of start with that will help us get into this conversation a bit more. She says this: "It sometimes seems as if people on the left love revolution but hate the party. We enthusiastically support transformation, especially personal transformation. Yet, in the same breath, we scoff at institutionalized practices strategically oriented toward the pursuit of radical political change." Okay, so this is a really interesting thing. People in the U.S., at least, really like the idea of social transformation, the idea of revolution. That's kind of what being a leftist is all about, is overturning this bad butt of a society that we live in, for something else. And it's like
Cuss alert.
Cuss alert, sorry. This bad, stinky butt of a society that we live in. We love the idea of overthrowing it, but we are not really sold on the idea of how to overthrow it or like how to transform it. So it's just like kind of a weird situation, but I think that is just like a good description of the kind of world that we live in. Leftists want to do something, they want something different, and like, you know, it's good to want that, but at the same time, we're not really willing to, I guess, like take up that type of organization for one reason or another. And the reason why is kind of hard, you know, whether it's just like a disenchantment with organized politics, or there's tactical problems, or there's like, you know, other situations going on. We'll kind of get into that in a minute. This whole thing reminds me of this time I actually got to see Jodi Dean speak, which is a pretty wild situation. I was at this conference with Richard Gilman-Opolsky, who was my master's advisor, who we've talked about a lot on this show, and I like him a lot. Just wanted to say it.
He's a good one.
And anyway, so Jodi Dean gave the keynote lecture at this conference, and it was about like it was about crowds and parties, basically, because it was around that time. And she was just kind of trying to convince people. She was trying to convince people is kind of a silly way to put it, because it was a room full of like old academic Marxists. She was like, "Listen, you guys should like reevaluate the idea of joining a communist party." And everyone in the room was like, "Yeah, okay." The questions after the talk were really funny, because it was like, I don't know, seriously, maybe like a few hundred people were just like, "Hey, Jodi Dean, this is a really cool talk. Thanks a lot. You had a very funny slideshow full of memes. We all appreciate that. Where can we all sign up?" And then that was kind of the end of the conversation. And it was really wild, because like that, I guess, is kind of the question, right? Like, where do we sign up? People want a transform society. It seems like there is in some ways some like energy towards that idea of a party, but at the same time still no one's like taken the initiative to like just sign people up, which is a radically strange idea, or like a strange problem. And, you know, not to say that there aren't parties that are actively trying to do that. Like, I mean, Jodi Dean herself is a part of the PSL, but like for some reason that form of activism and organization has not really just like caught on like wildfire. Caught on like wildfire amongst academics at the moment, or anybody, I guess, not just academics.
Yeah, I like Caught On by Wildflowers better.
Me too. It's better than wildfire, that's for sure.
Yeah, I would prefer to be part of a wildflower rampage. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Like, the party form has kind of collapsed in some ways by virtue of it being not really recognizable. Like, it's not ubiquitous. You know, the Communist Party USA still exists. The PSL exists, and there are other communist parties in the US and other parts of like the US and Canada that exist. But they're not, you know, they're not making like headlines in the news. If you wanted to join one, like, you would have to really work hard to learn about them, unless you were just fortunate enough, and I guess, to like know them by virtue of some organizing or something. And that makes sense. The people don't really feel like it's necessary. But and I guess I should say there's also another really interesting point that Jodi Dean brings up in another book called The Communist Horizon, which is a short little essay, totally worth reading. Because she says in there, leftists are justifiably anxious with regard to the party. A desire for collectivity is not the only desire for which parties have provided a form. They have also served as forms for desires for a master. And I think that's important to actually flag that and recognize that that's a legitimate concern. A lot of communists kind of write that off as being dumb, or I don't know. I mean, we'll talk about reasons why we think that's not the last word on parties, just like Jodi Dean does. But it's not a bad idea to admit that parties obviously are not perfect, and in the past, communist parties and socialist parties have made lots and lots of mistakes, and those mistakes have to do with everything from strategy to relationships to bureaucracy, etc. And in fact, like most party programs that I read today, I have like a weird I don't know, affinity for reading party programs, they often like go out of their way to talk about the mistakes of past parties, not least over bureaucratization or, as Jodi Dean calls it, a sort of form for a desire for a master. So, you know, that's another reason people don't like parties. Like they rightly intuit that there has been, you know, bad mechanisms within parties, and that turns them off and kind of makes them think that that's all there is to say about the party.
That's a good self-reflective practice, I think, to even just be upfront about maybe about the shortcomings of party organizations. After that time I saw Jodi Dean, I talked with my advisor about, you know, like what she said, and him being, I think, way more of a left communist than I am now, and, you know, maybe even was then. He said that it's like interesting because like no one is really asking for a party, and like it was right after Occupy Wall Street happened, and it like wasn't like people were asking for like, you know, a new communist party or something. But it was interesting to him that Jodi Dean was calling for one, even though like activists weren't asking for it. And I think that at the time that really made sense to me, that like people like weren't really seeking this out for some reason, or it seemed that, or it seemed like that was the case at least. But even. But now I think I wonder what he would say, or I mean, I even wonder what I say sometimes too, because I mean, I'm not a Marxist-Leninist, but I'm not closed off to the idea, that's for sure. But like, it seems like people are kind of asking for that now. I mean, like the entryway that the DSA has provided for people in at least the United States has been a really interesting kind of thing, because all of a sudden, like the leftist discourse is like, you know, all about organizing and all about like, you know, structures and bylaws, and people get like in huge Twitter arguments about the wording of bylaws for their DSA branch or whatever. So if people are getting like this energized by the idea of organization, maybe like the energy is there for a party or something.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's also interesting because in both the Communist Horizon and Crowds and Party, Jodi Dean uses Occupy Wall Street as her argumentative foil, and she does so as somebody who participated in it. So she was part of it and was trying to think it through, and especially to think through its failures. And, you know, like, it did not succeed in, like, gaining any real tangible, lasting, like, structural changes after the 2008 financial crisis. It's not to say that it was useless or anything like that. But the mode of horizontal organizing that Occupy preferred didn't provide us with the means to, you know, build socialism after one of the like worst financial crises in like recent memory, which is a compelling point.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
All right, so let's maybe talk a little bit about why people should like parties. I feel like people have lots of very easy reasons that they could probably think of why people don't like parties. But I think trying to work through a little bit of a critical apparatus with respect to some of those objections, and then a more affirming apparatus of like why parties are good or could be good would be useful. So here's kind of a quick, polemical but really useful quote from Crowds and Party. Jodi Dean writes, I should set this up real quick. So she's talking about like, she wades into debates between anarchists and Marxists and a number of different kinds of Marxists, and she wants to say that there's a kind of straw man argument that happens with respect to calls for the party that always reduce parties down into their most authoritarian or centralized possible, forms. And she wants to say that, well, that is way too easy to kind of dismiss. So she says this: the charge of the few dominating the many thrown about so vigorously on the left illuminates nothing specific to Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, socialism, or communism. Rather, it points to the challenges of organization, duration, and extension that persist after the dissipation of crowds. The gap of politics is unavoidable. Repeating the critique of centralism and authoritarianism time after time and setting after setting reinscribes fantasies of a politics without politics, fantasies of a beautiful moment when the many immediately know and realize their desire. To the extent that the left fails to recognize and take responsibility for the enabling condition of political collectivity, it will remain trapped in its own self-critique, unable to build or seize the organizations it needs. So there's a lot to pull apart in that short little paragraph. I think there's a lot of really good points that she makes, but a couple to just maybe get us chatting. One, I think, is the problem of authoritarianism or centralism is not unique to Marxism per se, but is just a problem in all of politics, I think is a really good point. We've talked about that in the past, about sort of anarchism, that sometimes anarchists will disavow hierarchy or power or authority only to find it cropping up in different ways. And then another point that I think is really neat is this idea that there really is no sort of pure standpoint, right? You have to sort of throw yourself in and then just deal with the problems as they come, rather than getting all your like theoretical ducks in a row such that you think there might not be problems after that.
Yeah, I find this to be a really interesting way of thinking about political organization, or at least a really sober look at it. Like, one of the things I end up studying and kind of teaching a lot in my classes is like organizational communication, and just thinking about the ways that like organizations are set up and like kind of like how power flows through them. And I think in just doing those types of analyses and like thinking about like org charts and dumb stuff like that, I think what you recognize is exactly what she said, that there's like, you know, the few dominating the many doesn't say anything specific about like Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. It's just like something that people have to deal with in hierarchical institutions. And there are like ways to negotiate that with regards to like the design of an institution. So I think that like that knee-jerk fear of like, oh man, if there's a party, that means someone's in charge, and if someone's in charge, that means they're going to tell me to clean my room, and that makes me very afraid, is just like kind of unfounded, because like good luck being a part of any kind of thing that doesn't have that problem. But it's also like it just ends up being such a strange fear, that type of disavowal, because like organizations always find ways to deal with that. I mean, sometimes they fail and they find crappy ways to deal with it, but like that's politics. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is a good way to bring Christianity into the conversation a little bit as well, because there is a tendency, I think, for Christians to not want to get too involved in something that they feel is going to go off the rails, and they do that especially when it comes to politics. But the irony is that any Christian who's ever been part of a church knows that like church, which is supposed to be the place that's making you into a better and better person, is also often the place of like some really toxic or dysfunctional relationships. But, you know, Christians who are church-going Christians still go because they believe that there's something good underneath it, or at least there's something worth participating in those institutions despite all the problems, and those problems are things that you should work out, right? Like, nobody goes to church, or hopefully doesn't go to church, expecting it to be a perfect community. And ironically, though Christians understand that about their own kind of worship practices, they don't usually extend that same kind of logic to their political associations or actions.
Here's a weird suggestion that is going to sound silly. Non-religious leftists who are afraid of like the inherent sort of like badness of power or hierarchy ought to go to see like a church board meeting in action. Because like, yeah. Listen, like deciding on the bylaws of your DSA organization, or like, you know, the bylaws of any organization, any leftist group or whatever, I'm sure that at times they could be very tense and very uncomfortable. But listen, you have not seen a single thing until you've seen people at church arguing over a budget, or arguing over like how much money you should give to like this group or whatever. I've never been a part of anything that has been more politically contentious than like a church board meeting. It is, I think, pretty buck wild.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that I think Jodi Dean is pointing out here too, right? Like, you couldn't ever go anywhere where you're not going to have those kinds of problems. So like, you might as well just not pretend that you could, right? Just, I guess, embrace the problems, pick the problems you want to have.
Yeah, but I think what is cool, I mean, like, okay, so at my church, the way that we resolve those really tense moments is like that they use Robert's Rules of Order, and the same thing I think at most DSA places. You know, like there's a sort of a mechanism of decision making where it seems at least like it's mostly equitable, even though it's tense, right? And
right.
And that those types of mechanisms or like protocols are really important to develop, and it's not like Marxist parties, like communist parties, Marxist, Leninist parties haven't also thought about that. Like democratic centralism is a mode of decision making that I think is like, I don't know, for the most part pretty fair and not bad. So I don't know, there are different ways to like, kind of negotiate power within hierarchy. It's not just that like I mean, the most tired thing, or the most tired misunderstanding, is that like hierarchy is always authoritarian, because it's not. Like, there are just different ways to negotiate power when there is sort of like a hierarchy of decision makers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, anybody who's ever been part of a communist party or organization in general will tell you, like, there's all kinds of rules and regulations and rights that you have as a member that get negotiated or represented in one way or another. Like, it isn't the case that everybody just kind of like does whatever the party says whenever it says to do X or Y.
Right.
There's like a lot of complicated moving parts, and you got to find your place within it, just like anything else.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so maybe that's like a good way to start talking about what parties actually do. Like, okay, there's lots of reasons people don't join them. There's also a lot of reasons why maybe in spite of those reasons you should join them. But if you did, what would you be looking forward to?
Yeah. Well, luckily for us, Jodi Dean's already got this figured out. We're going to pull from Marx here in a second, too. So if you're like, Jodi Dean, whatever, and you're all about Marx, just wait. But Jodi Dean says this about parties and like what they should do. The role of the party isn't to inject knowledge into the working class, nor is it to represent the interests of the working class on the train of politics. Rather, the function of the party is to hold open a gap in our setting so as to enable a collective desire for collectivity. The crowd's breach of the predictable and given creates the possibility that a political subject might appear. The party steps into that breach and fights to keep it open for people. I think this is a really, actually a pretty different way of talking about what the party does with relation to Marx, but we'll get there in a minute. But still, I think this is pretty good. It's probably better than Marx in some ways. But I like the idea of like holding open a gap, or kind of like giving like some direction. The party steps in that breach and fights to keep it open for the people is cool, because it's like, I guess like the thing about politics is that people who pay attention to politics, or people who are most vulnerable to the whims of capitalist politics, I think are people who are also like really vulnerable to falling to sort of like despair or depression, or just understanding the tragedy of moments. And having a group of people who are willing to like stay there and give direction in light of those types of tragedy or like moments of despair is really valuable. So like people who are there saying like, listen, there's something else you can do, even though this is very bad, is good. So I think that's a cool way to put it.
Yeah, for sure. And I really like the way that she talks about how the party sort of holds open a gap that gets opened. I think that's great, because the assumption isn't that the party just kind of like goes around and like messes stuff up and like that's what makes the party so great. It's like, well, in the world, like things get messed up. And like the party steps into like the big mess and is like, all right, everyone, don't worry. Once people clean it up, like we're going to know how the mess happened in the first place. And we're going to keep on thinking about that for a while. And like, we'll be there when the next mess happens, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's a kind of a institutional memory that gets deposited within parties. And I mean, when you are part of a party, I think one of the big benefits is being able to talk with people who have been involved in struggles for a lot longer than you have, or have gained experience. And, you know, the party is an apparatus that is learning all the time from those kinds of things together. And I think that's like a really neat way that Jodi Dean puts it. Like you get the sense that the party is really organic, really dynamic, and it gains all of its being by virtue of being with the people and being sort of for the people, rather than like trying to take them over, or I don't know, like speak for them or something like that.
Yeah. So something else. So, okay. I mean, I'm going to say this not as my own experience, but as an observation based on, you know, other friends' experience, because I don't actually belong to a party, which is not great, but kind of a byproduct of being a rule person. So parties, like, they do that, right? Like they kind of direct people, but there's also something else that parties do, in the sense that they have like I guess you might just call it like an institutional memory, or like you know, they have they're a group of people who have built up like a common type of understanding of the world that is like much older than just like, you know, people on Twitter talking about, you know, the political discourse, or talking about theory or something, right? If you're involved in like a group of activists, you have people who have like who have like been through it in one way or another, who have, you know, been a part of struggles and can kind of contribute their experience to the like the memory stores of the collectivity, right? You have people who know what they're talking about. That's all, I guess all I'm trying to say is in a really fancy way is that like the good thing about joining a party is that there will be people that are in that organization that know what's up, and that's awesome.
Yeah, I should say by way of experience, there's a guy in the Communist Party of Canada named Danny Goldstick, and he's quite old now, but very like spry and intelligent dude. And I love talking to him because his parents were communists, and then he was a communist, and like his whole life has been in the party. He like ran for office a few times, and it's great to talk to him because like there are things that I read about and then I wonder about on my own, and then I see Danny and I'm like, oh hey, what was it like when this happened? And he's like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like I remember what this person said and like who was there and who got involved, and you know like. Being able to actually talk to somebody who was committed to the struggle at that time and is still committed to the struggle at this time is like really fascinating. And it's a lot more important, I think, than like sitting at home and reading Marx on your own, or even like showing up at a couple of like important protests or marches, because it helps you to like train your own kind of institutional memory as well.
Yeah, I think so. Just like going to church.
It's true.
Okay, so that's so far we've gotten into a lot of what Jodi Dean has said about the Communist Party, which I think she's a person really qualified to talk about it. She's really great. You know, okay, sorry, let me make a quick plug. Jodi Dean is really good. Go read Crowds and Parties. Crowds and Parties. Go read Communist Horizon, but really what you need to do is get out there and read her book on aliens. It is so great. It's a really different book, but super fun. It's a little bit dated because it was written in the late 90s, but listen, Jodi Dean talking about aliens is my favorite. All right. that's the Jodi Dean deep cut.
The truth is out there.
Yeah, the truth is out there. And the truth is, go read that book. Cool. So Jodi Dean has a lot to say about parties, but other communists do too. Especially Marx. Marx has some interesting things to say about parties. I mean, it's like different contextually because of sort of the, you know, historical situation that he was in. But still, it's kind of an interesting way to think about the party and like what it should actually do. Might as well, you know, go right to the horse's mouth and see what this big communist horse said about the Communist Party. Yikes, that's a whole lot of weird things I just said. That's worse than swears, I think. Not challenging language, but a real challenging idea.
The cusser's cuss.
The cusser's cuss. Oh, man. All right. Well, at the very beginning of the second part of the Communist Manifesto, called Proletarians and Communists, Marx lays out exactly what he thinks that the communists like should do and who they are and how they should relate to the proletariat. So I'm going to read a few chunks and we'll kind of talk through it, and then we can read a few more chunks. Let's chunk this one out. So Marx says, in what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from other working class parties by this only. In the national struggles of the proletarians of different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. And the second thing that they bring to the table is in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie had to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. So Marx goes on to say some other things too that we can get to in a minute, but in this iteration here, I think it's kind of pretty easy to see what Marx has in mind, that like the communists aren't a group of people who are supposed to be separate from the proletarians, right? They're supposed to be definitely sort of part of that struggle. They're not like a separate party. They don't have any special interests. They just want the interests of the proletariat. But the way Marx talks about the communists with relation to the proletariat as kind of like a party is kind of like a constant. Like they're the people that are supposed to be there and constantly point out like, okay, so the proletariat wants this. This is like what the proletariat in other countries are kind of after. They're trying to like, I guess like like establish a type of continuity between different struggles in different places, and that seems like an interesting idea.
Yeah. I mean, it goes along, I think, a little bit with Jodi Dean's thing about like holding that gap open, trying to step in when even that gap might not be clear to everybody at the same time.
Yeah, I think so too. I feel like in Marx's explanation, you could see how people might accuse communists of telling the proletariat like what to do, like in the sense that like you want to make sure that you in national struggles the communists point out and bring to front the common interests of the entire proletariat, in the sense that like the party might be there saying like, okay, we know that you are demanding this, but really it's in your best interest to do this thing, right? I guess you could read that in there, and that's definitely maybe how it's worked out sometimes, but I think that like charitably you could read Marx and not really get that point.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's true, and I think it's also worth pointing out too that like, how to say this, like the long history of communist parties is really interesting, because it's a like transmission of ideas and practice in history that like starts with this kind of idea, right, all the way back to Marx, and then is filtered through how communists actually did end up having to organize alongside the proletariat to accomplish these very goals.
Yeah. Well, so Marx finishes up his point saying that the communists therefore are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. So this could again kind of come off negatively if you read it that way, but also, I mean, you kind of get Marx's point. I mean, Marx has a philosophical project that's tied to his his like communist project. So what Marx is saying here is like the communists should like be people who know how to read history, and like understand like what needs to be done. So it could sound bad, I guess, but I don't think it's intended to be like the communists telling people what to do.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's also like we were just saying, like communists as a group are supposed to kind of be the people who are intentionally thinking about struggles all the time, right? Like that's what communist parties do. Like they think together about stuff and they reflect on it and they try to strategize in light of all that thinking. That's not true of the proletariat as a whole. I mean, it's true of certain specific proletarians maybe, or like members of the proletariat. But it isn't the case that like every worker is out there thinking of, their struggle. And the communists sort of make that their responsibility or their job, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And they're lobbying for a very specific vision, and like, good for them. I mean, the proletariat is not, you can't substitute it for the Communist Party. It's not the same. Right.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about communist parties. What are they? What are they for? What aren't they for? Etc. But let's talk a little bit about how Christians have shown up in or alongside or in relation to communist parties. This is going to be kind of like a quick, I guess, like greatest hits of some episodes that we've done in the past. Just thinking through and pulling together some threads that we've already talked through to see how certain Christian people or movements relate to communist parties. So let's start maybe closer to home, I guess, in Canada and the US, and in the labor movement with A.E. Smith. We did an episode on him, and Grace Hutchins. We did an episode on her. So what's really fascinating about both of them is that they both start out as like really zealous Christians. Smith becomes a pastor. Hutchins is kind of a missionary, but definitely a social gospel Christian. And the two of them get like so invested in the labor struggle because of their Christianity that they end up getting pretty fed up with like reactionary tendencies of other Christians that they meet or have to work alongside. And they end up adopting the Communist Party of the USA and Canada, respectively. So I don't know, Matt, what do you think about that? Like, what do Smith and Hutchins kind of tell us a little bit about Christians and maybe one relationship they could have to the Communist Party?
Yeah, A.E. Smith and Grace Hutchins, of the list that we've made of these greatest hits, to me, they're actually the most difficult to deal with. On the one hand, like, I think that their lives are really instructive. Like, they were people who were really motivated by the gospel to, like, also be socialists, which is great. And they embodied a certain type of ethic, and I think that's cool and inspirational. But it's a bummer that they end up stop being Christians for the most part to join the party. And I know that there's like a lot of stuff bound up in that too. Like, I can't imagine being around a bunch of communists during the labor movement in North America being super like thrilled that you were a Christian, and probably trying to persuade you otherwise. Or even just being in the environment, seeing like people around you do this type of work, you might think like, well, like, why do I need this church at all if they're going to be like really reactionary? So anyways, I guess like on the one hand, to me, it's like kind of disappointing because like I think it would be really cool and rad if they were just like, okay, we're going to be Christians and join the Communist Party, and like that's just going to be our thing. But on the other hand, I get where they're coming from, because I'm sure it was a very difficult thing to go to church and then also go to a party meeting and then like have people at church give you the stink eye.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right that we kind of start out with the most difficult case. Maybe we should have saved them for the end. But I think that one thing that always kind of comes up for me, especially when I think about Smith, but also Hutchins, is that the Communist Party basically helps them give certain answers to questions that they couldn't really figure out within Christianity, which is too bad. Like, it's too bad that Christianity actually wasn't as advanced as communism, such that they could figure that out. But I think that's actually really instructive, right? That, like, I don't think that you have to abandon your faith if you join a Communist Party. And at least, like, people I know and my own experience hanging out with communists is, like, they don't really ask you to do that too much these days either. But one thing that you can super gain from hanging out with communists is a way of actually making sense of like real possible political solutions to the kinds of things that Christianity attunes you to get upset about, like people being poor or whatever.
Yeah, I guess my big concern, okay, this is not really a big concern, but you know how like sometimes somebody will say something mean to you and you're always like really afraid that it's actually true or something. I guess like when it comes to these examples, it makes me a little bit it makes me kind of like, I guess, like sensitive to this fact or something, that like I feel like people will look at examples like A.E. Smith or Grace Hutchins and how they like, moved away from Christianity and just joined the Communist Party and like kind of disavowed their faith. And they'll think that like, well, that's what Christian communists are. They're really just people who are communists who want to like, evangelize to Christians or something, or they want to, they just want to like they want to stuff communism into like a Christian shell or something. That's like what the trads are always onto us about, right? They're always just like accusing us that like we're not really Christians, we're actually just communists who like have this tinge of Christianity to it. And
it's the Trojan horse.
Yeah. Well, and like I don't think that's true, because like I don't know, I think that we're both actually pretty faithful and devout people for being like on a podcast where we are very supportive of saying swears and cusses. But I'm always really afraid that like that could secretly be true, but like I don't want it to be, and I don't think it is. It's just something in the background whenever I think through these characters like of Smith and Hutchins. So there it is. I laid it all on the line, bared my soul on this podcast, and that's all I gotta say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would still love you for sure if you decide to go that route. It's fine.
Well, like I don't. I mean, I think there's like I don't feel like that would ever be something I would do specifically. It's just like something I'm really sensitive about, I suppose. Something I'm really worried. The trads have got under my skin and they're just getting to
me. Yeah, fair enough. That's their job. All right, well, let's move on to a more uplifting case then. Maybe this will bring you back around. And that's the Christians for National Liberation in the Philippines. This is a group that we are both endlessly fascinated by and have continued to study despite only doing one episode on them, just because they're like the most wild and interesting kind of Christian group I think that we've discovered together still. I feel that way anyway.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And so for people who don't know, the Christians for National Liberation, or abbreviated as the CNL, they are part of something called the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, the NDFP, which is a unified front that includes the Communist Party of the Philippines, which sort of brought it into being, but they're like a member organization. So the CNL is fascinating because they're an explicit group of Christians, like that's their thing, it's in their name, who are committed to this front, like this actual, cooperative, networked, intersecting group of leftist and communist organizations. And I think they're so fascinating for a lot of reasons. I mean, their history is really brave and courageous. But what they show structurally with respect to the Communist Party is that sometimes Christians can actually have their own interests represented as Christians in relation to communist struggle, and that isn't seen as oppositional at all. In fact, it's seen as a boon to the communist movement to have Christians be Christians in the movement. And that's something I just kind of think about a lot as a really interesting case study.
Yep, this what makes me feel better. Yeah, I mean, it's something, the CNL, I guess, I mean, they absolutely are the most interesting thing I've ever heard about in my entire life. I mean, like, we deal with, like, a ton of history on this show and, like, historical movements or historical people, and they're all great and fantastic and wonderful, and I'm glad they existed. But the CNL still exists. Like, that's what's wild to me.
Right.
And they, like, every now and again, Liberation, the NDFP newspaper, will like post stories about them or communiques from them, and they're like still people like standing out there with signs and like protesting with bandanas on their face, or they're in the jungle or whatever, right? I guess to me that seems like I'm about to use a real Marxist-Leninist term, and I don't like it, but they're like the CNL and the NDFP is a real advanced sort of socialist organization, because like they figured it out. They figured the thing out that like most other communist parties or socialists haven't been able to, and the thing they figured out was like you can create a space for Christians and like religious people in your organization and it not be bad, and like they figured it out and no one else did, and it's just them. So pay attention.
Yeah, there's an amazing reflection from Jose Maria Cizon, who's the leader of the Communist Party of the Philippines, where he tells the story of the CNL from his perspective, and it's so awesome because he basically is like, yeah, I don't know, we were a bunch of like materialists, and then everywhere we looked, there were these Christians doing wild stuff, and we got together, and like they agreed to read some Maoist stuff. We agreed to like talk to them about their religion, and it turned out that like we were kind of all on the same page. It's like the coolest story of like not really worrying that much about like, I don't know, crossing all your like ideological T's and dotting all the I's or whatever. It's just like, well, we're all in it, and then that's what they did. Like they made a big umbrella organization where everybody's in it.
Yeah, so the NDFP, if you go to the website, they just redid their website. They did a rebrand, a refresh. It looks really great, but it has like a banner of all the different organizations that are a part of the NDFP. So like Christians for National Liberation are right there, a few tiles down from like the People's Army, and a few tiles down from like the scientists for the people or whatever in the Philippines. So like I don't know, there's like one of the gang. It's pretty dope.
It is.
Okay, so next on the list, this is a throwback to, I don't know, a bunch of episodes ago, when we read Fidel and Religion. So even in Cuba, a place that Christianity is supposed to be suppressed, it's not, I guess, as much as you'd think. Marxist-Leninist parties always get the rap of being atheist, and people of faith have to hide their faith, or they just can't be involved or whatever. But it's notable that in 1992, Fidel allowed people to be open about their Christian faith within the Communist Party of Cuba, which means that they were probably Christians in the party before that. They were kind of hush-hush about it. But in 1992, it was kind of like relaxed and opened up so that you could be a person of faith but also be in the Communist Party. So there you go. That's what that, it's different than the approach the CNL had, because there was a time of repression, but it's still a different socialist organization figuring it out.
Yeah, and even that time of repression, like Fidel makes clear in his conversations with Fray Beto in that Fidel and Religion book, it's not because he didn't want people to be Christians or didn't think that you could be Christian and communist. It was just that for him at that moment in time, and for the Communist Party of Cuba itself, the goal was like, we've got to figure out all this communist stuff and we'll figure out the Christian stuff later. It's not like, you couldn't sort of like you could be like a Christian who supported the communist revolution in Cuba, and in fact, like lots and lots and lots of them did. So I think that's like a really interesting kind of way to look at it. Like these are Christians who related to the Communist Party within Cuba, maybe not openly as members of it or whatever, but also not like alienated by virtue of their faith per se. Not that never happened or something. Like Fidel also talks about that a little bit, but he like didn't like it, that some Christians got targeted by certain party members that were a little overzealous. And then later on, things developed, and now you can be a Christian in the Communist Party of Cuba, and it's no big deal.
No big deal at all. Yeah. Again, another throwback to an episode we did a gazillion years ago. Christians for Socialism was an organization in Chile during the Allende government. They weren't formally a part of like the Socialist Party of Chile, but they were like, I don't know, a para organization or something. You know, they were a group that was definitely like not formally a part of the Socialist Party, but also not all that divorced. Again, just like a group of Christians who, you know, found a place to be in that struggle for socialism.
Yeah, I think they're also really interesting because like the Declaration of the 80s was 80 priests who kind of wrote a thing talking about how they supported the Allende government and they wanted to help Christians learn how to support it. What's so fascinating about that is they basically go out of their way to say like, yeah, okay, so we're not part of the Socialist Party as an organization, but we're like committed to figuring it out with them. And I think that is a really fascinating thing. Like just kind of the fact that they would make it clear that they were affirming of the party and of the revolutionary changes that were happening in Chile, even while marking their distance from it, or at least their uniqueness from it. And I think that's also like a really unique and fascinating model to kind of, you know, lend your support and also say like we're supporting it as this thing in particular.
Yeah, it would be really fascinating. Like in a future episode, we should revisit that and see like what the response was from the Socialist Party of Chile, if they were like, you know, down or if they were hesitant or something. But that's a future conversation, I suppose.
Yeah, I know that Allende sent like a letter of like welcoming and thanks to them when they had their first like big conference or whatever. So he was like into it.
Yeah.
And Fidel like came to chill with them when he visited Allende. So that's cool.
That's true. I guess it doesn't get any better than that. All right, so the next example is another throwback to a different episode, but so far we've talked mostly about like historical examples and also historical examples from Christians and socialists of different regions, whether it be the Caribbean, Asia, or Latin America. We have now an example that is a bit more contemporary, even though not entirely, and also in North America. So maybe this one will be even more instructive or more illuminating about the ways that Christians could deal with communist parties. But like I said, this one's different. So we've been talking about the ways that Christians have like been a part of a parties, or like, you know, like kind of like what that relationship has looked like. But I think one that's really interesting to me is the example of the Young Lords. We have episodes in the past about them where we talked with Daryl Wands of Serrano about the church offensive, and we even have another episode where we talk about the other church offensive. There's two church offensives. It's great. There should be more, but the church offensive is this thing that the Young Lords did where like basically once in Chicago and then once in New York, the Young Lords, which are not like a political party, but they are like they became a political party, but they were like a group, you know, an activist group, not unlike the Black Panthers or something, who were really interested in showing up for their community and making sure people had, you know, sort of like the things they needed to survive and live. So they decided that they would just start showing up to churches and asking if they could use their space. And in New York, it didn't work out so well. They occupied a church and they ended up getting arrested. In Chicago, it worked out a little bit better, but not for a very long time. But in both these examples, it's like not Christians really like participating in a communist organization or a party, but it's communists showing up to church. And I think that's kind of good too, maybe better in some ways. Or at least maybe it's like it's more like the role of the party or the communist organization in the sense of like they're people who are kind of directing the way or like holding open a gap. because like the young lords, when they showed up to these churches to do the church offensive, and start, the People's Church, they were trying to help Christians see like what it would actually look like for them to show up for their own communities. It's such a wild thing to me in New York that the congregation was like so against the church offensive, that they're so against the People's Church, that the young lords had to seize it. But I think it's a really interesting thing when like, that communists would be, they have sort of a goal and an operation in mind, but that they would like show up to a church, a place where, they are most likely not welcome, and still try to like, do the thing that they want to do the right thing.
Yeah, for sure. They're also a really interesting example because they explicitly draw on like Christian themes and stuff in the occupation of the church. And it's kind of neat that like, they didn't show up and they were like, "Hey, you dumb Christians, you want to do something really good? Just be a communist or whatever." It was like they showed up and they were like, "Hey, did you know that like Jesus is actually revolutionary?" And I think that's like really fascinating that it isn't just the case that Christians are in communist parties, but communist parties are locating Jesus in and outside the church in really weird and interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just think about how like weird of a thing it would be like at your church if like one Sunday your priest or your pastor was going through like the prayers of the people or something, and they were like, okay, and someone wants to pray for an end to imperial wars. All right, that's
Right.
okay, sure. Or like, you had like a potluck and someone showed up and they were like handing out Mao's red book or something. It'd just be like a weird thing. I think that church people are usually at least surface level very nice. So communists out there, you could show up and they would at least be kind to you, to your face.
Yeah. I'd love to hear those stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, let's round out this conversation and close it off by talking, I guess, much too quickly about maybe why Christians should join communist parties or how or what that would even mean. So I think like this is a really hard question to answer because we've spent this whole hour like talking about communist parties, kind of talking them up, talking about how cool they are, how cool they could be, what they've done, etc. But it is still true that like that problem we talked about right at the beginning with Jodi Dean, that you couldn't really point to like one specific party that's kind of doing all the things, is still a problem. Like you can't really identify the Communist Party that every Christian should just go join on all these reasons, right? I don't know. How do you kind of navigate that complexity, Matt?
Very poorly, in fact. Like, I mean, I think that there's a few roadblocks to the party for Christians, and not just for Christians, but just for people, that there is not like one identifiable communist party that has such a strong presence that it can be like easily recognizable as the Communist Party is really difficult. Like I said, like I live in the middle of nowhere. It's not like there's a Communist Party like, or it's not like there's even like a DSA like in my town, right? Or even there's not even a DSA meeting like I could go to that's in like 45 minutes of my town. So like I think people are often pretty isolated from those. From radical movements in general, unless you live in a big city, which isn't always true, but it seems to be true in my case.
Right.
But even if I did, right, even if I was like lived in a big city, not even a big city, even if I lived in some kind of like urban area, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna join the Communist Party. It's like, okay, but like which one? Would I join like Socialist Alternative, or would I join like CPUSA, or would I join the PSL? Or would I just be a DSA guy, or like what, right? Like that there are so many and not sort of like something that's unified. It's just like such a weird and hard thing to navigate. Like if it was the 1950s and you're like, listen, I'm going to join the Communist Party, like everyone knows what you're talking about. And there's no question about
Right.
like, oh, like, are you a Trotskyist though? Or something like that. Like they're not going to ask you some kind of like weird tendency question. Anyways, the fragmentation of the Communist Party is, in some ways understandable, but like bad if you want to have a mass movement.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's no value in like denying the actual gravity of the problem. I think that's really important for communists. And all the best communists like will not do that denial. Like, they'll admit that, you know, whatever, we don't live in a revolutionary situation, and like, isn't that kind of a bummer? But that being said, like, I think that there are a lot of ways to be involved in communist parties. Some of them have like at-large memberships that are worth looking at. Sometimes it's like even something as simple as having a subscription to like their like a communist newspaper is really cool. Like, I'm subscribed to the People's Voice in Canada, and it's really great. Like, I learn all kinds of things about what the Communist Party of Canada thinks about different protests or strikes or world events and things like that. And I think that like Christians should think about how best to connect to those things, even if they can't like totally join them or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, that probably looks different for a lot of folks. But it's also something to think about, like how to have that relationship.
Yeah, I think so too. The PSL are really excited to send you the newspaper, and I get about 10 copies every month. I kind of just like leave them out around campus or in my building, and no one really takes them or reads them, but I like to read them, and it's cool to have that kind of connection, even though that's like it, you know. Or I get the DSA one too, and it's fine in its own way, and disappointing in its own way too. But those kinds of connections are good. I don't know. Talk with people. There's one point when Derek Ford was on the podcast, he was like, you know, not everyone can join the party, or it's like it doesn't make sense for everyone to join like the PSL even. But like, you know, he did say that like they're willing to put you to work if you want to do something. So there you go.
Yeah, I think it's true also to just kind of reconsider what Christians might gain from party organizing. Like we talked about earlier, parties have an organizational capacity, and they can help Christians learn more about struggles that Christians want to address, right? They carry these institutional memories. I think that's really important. Like, Christians don't get that just by sitting around and reading together or even listening to a podcast or whatever, obviously. Like, you have to make some kind of connections with people who are like on the ground, hopefully somewhat close to where you are, such that you could actually learn about what it's like to be on the ground or be where you are. And in my experience anyway, communists are like all too happy to hear that anyone wants to hear what they're up to. So I don't know, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, I think so. So unfortunately, even though like saying that you're going to join the Communist Party sounds like really exciting and like cool or whatever, organizing is really difficult work, and especially if you don't live in a place where, you know, there's already people interested. It's not like there's like one really good solution to this. It's just kind of like it's kind of like a bummer. It's like the recognition that like, yeah, it would be really cool if we could be more connected in a party structure, or we could have a mass movement. But the situation is like, yeah, the gravity of the situation probably is not lost on anybody, that it's very difficult to like, you know, do that. But at the same time, you should still try to find some way to get involved. And while that's not like a super exciting conclusion to this podcast, it's still the right one. You should find some way to get involved. There you go. That's all you got to do. Just find some way to do it.
Bear that fruit.
Bear that fruit in 2019. Get them delicious communist and Christian oranges off that tree.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. You can also find us all over the internet, and we have a Facebook group. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. Let's see, what else do we have going on? Nothing too crazy. I guess it's worth mentioning again, Amoria has a really amazing album out right now, amoriashay.bandcamp.com, or an EP anyway. And she did the amazing music in our intro and in our transitions. And we will, as always, close out with a song from The Illogical Spoon.
I don't want to get up and church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.